I remade this render 8 years later. Here's what I learnt. For the modelling, I just loaded in the ref, then in the front view, grabbed a cylinder and extruded it and scaled it to match the reference. Added in a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it, and then added in your supporting loops to control the curves. Instead of using a solidify modifier, I decided to model the interior of the glass separate to the stem. And a nice tip is that you can grab one open edge and press F on it to fill an entire face, which allowed me to quickly fill in the edge of this wine glass. And also, when modelling the interiors of objects, make sure you recalculate normals with Shift N too. Now I just added in a simple backdrop, turned down the roughness of the material on the glass, and turned up the transmission. Now let's jump back in time to this old scene. Now the glass in here is separated out into two parts, and the reason I did this was so I could use it as a collision object for the simulation separately. However, I've since learned that the correct way to do this is to use one glass for the render that's all connected, and then use a different object for your simulation and your collision object. Another tip for working with glass, make sure you set it slightly above the surface it's on, or the reflections won't be correct as you'll see the ground from inside of it. One last thing that really elevates your realism is caustics. And if you don't know what caustics are, they're these bright patches you see when light shines through glass, and they're super easy to set up. First you need to enable them on your light or world light, then enable them to cast on your glass or liquid object, then enable them to receive on your ground plane. You also have to make sure that they're enabled under light paths here. From that point on I started working on my fluid sim, so I started by creating a box encompassing everything as a domain object, and a small sphere as an inflow object which I keyframed to turn off after a certain number of frames, press play, and it was clear there was some issues with my scale. One solution would be to globally scale up my scene, but seeing as I didn't really feel like doing that, I decided to use a paid add-on called Flip Fluids. I really think it's worth the cost for the additional control and functionality. It also works better at any scale really. So I installed the add-on and set up my domain and effectors again, left everything at default settings, baked it, and I was getting some fluid, but it wasn't colliding with the glass object. It took me a while to figure out, but eventually I realised that the thickness of the glass was less than 1 voxel size of the simulation, so it wouldn't be able to collide with it. So I just duplicated out the glass, made it a bit thicker for the simulation. Spent a while tweaking the settings and eventually ended up with a high-res result I was happy with, much better than my previous fluid sim which was blobby and low-res. For the shading on any liquid or drink, I always set up a clear material using transmission, and then give it a colour using a volume absorption with a bright colour, and then to darken it I increase the density. And this is a physically accurate way to model liquids. You can see the difference in my old render where the highlights were actually coloured red. I like to check different frames and angles to make sure the density feels correct. At this point I was happy with my shaders, so I started to look at some composition and lighting. I loaded in a nice studio world light to give interesting reflections and fill light. And this is very different from what I did before, which was just sort of adding one disc light. And the difference now is that you get a lot more fill light and you never quite get anything that looks quite as dark or as black as before. At this point I also decided to change how I was simulating the fluid by instead dropping a large ball of it in rather than simulating pouring, as this gave a more uniform and a quicker result. Then I ended up bringing in some extra assets to fill out the scene some more, but I didn't end up using these in the final render, but I thought I'd show you anyway as it was part of my creative process. This stage of the process I like to try out a couple different HDRs and moods for the scene so I can find what works best. Like here I tried using a natural HDR rather than the studio one, but I ended up reverting as I preferred the studio lighting more. Also tried having the scene set up on a tabletop in a more natural setting, but I didn't like that either. I wanted to stay truer to my original render. I ended up duplicating the wine glass to bring a bit more to the scene. By having these empty, it made the one with wine in it the focal element of the render. Kept playing with camera angles and depth of field until I found something I liked. Then I got the idea to place the scene on a velvet style backdrop, which is an idea I got from looking at high-end food photography. So I set up this little cloth simulation with this cube as a collider or a table, and a simple cloth that is pinned on one end. A nice trick for working with static cloth is to apply the simulation using the F3 Visual Geometry to Mesh function, and then you can scale around the mesh or edit it to match your scene a bit better. Now I can go back in with the camera and refine my composition with the new backdrop. I spent quite a while tweaking the HDR, playing around with different camera angles and composition. A nice tip for working with cloth is to use the sheen parameter to get it looking more realistic. It gives a nice edge to it. I eventually settled on bringing in these extra glasses to help with the composition. And also right at the end I like to try different camera angles to make sure I'm getting the best one. But yeah, that's pretty much it on how I would go about making this scene now. Here's the final render versus my old one. So really the scene's quite simple, but it shows you just how much can go into a simple scene and how much you can improve on simple renders.